Hey there. Welcome back to another peaceful evening together. Tonight, we're following a quiet walk along the shoreline, where the breeze carries memories and the ocean never forgets. This is Ruth's story. At 72, she returns to Seabreeze, the sleepy little beach town where she met Jack in the summer of year 1956. It was at a boardwalk cafe, under a striped umbrella, where laughter and lemonade first turned into love. Now, years later, she walks the shore alone, but not lonely, as the salt air stirs old memories, and soft sunlight paints the past in gentle colors. Before we begin, feel free to like this video and subscribe if these quiet stories bring you peace. And in the comments, I'd love to know where you're listening from, or if you feel like sharing, tell us about a place that still holds your heart no matter how much time has passed. Now, settle in, let the sound of the waves calm your thoughts, and drift with me into a summer that never really ended, just found a softer place to live. The waves whispered her name before anyone else did. Ruth stood at the edge of the sand, her shoes in one hand, the hem of her skirt fluttering in the late afternoon breeze. Seabreeze hadn't changed much, still slow, still sleepy, still smelling of salt and sun-drenched wood. The same crooked boardwalk slouched toward the ocean, and the faded white lifeguard stand watched over the shore like an old friend who never moved away. She hadn't been back in over 5 decades, not since 1956. The wind brushed against her silver hair as if to welcome her home, and she let her toes sink into the cool, familiar sand. Above, the sky was soft with high clouds drifting like memories. Everything around her felt distant and close all at once, like a dream she was walking through while still half awake. She took a slow breath, the kind that fills not just your lungs, but your whole chest, the kind you take when you're ready to remember. At 72, Ruth had come back not for the scenery, but for something quieter, something only she could hear, a feeling, a thread, a name. Jack. The name drifted through her thoughts like sea foam. Gentle, persistent. He had been here once, laughing over coffee at the boardwalk cafe, walking beside her with rolled-up pant legs, skipping stones into the waves. The last summer before the world became serious, before responsibilities, before distance, before the letter that never came. She began to walk, the old wooden slats of the boardwalk creaking under her bare feet. The same little shops remained, though older now, like her. The taffy stand was still there, its sign sun-faded and worn, and the Café Jack's Cafe still stood with its red and white awning, pulled halfway down as the day stretched toward evening. She paused. The table was still outside, that same corner table where they had met, where he had smiled up at her, that summer when she was just 17, and convinced life would never change. She almost sat. Almost. Instead, she let the moment rest like a shell in the sand, too precious to move, too fragile to touch just yet. A child's laugh echoed from farther down the boardwalk. A gull swooped low across the waterline, its wings casting a flicker of shadow across the shore. Ruth turned toward the sea again, letting her thoughts drift where they wanted to go. The air was thick with the scent of salt, aged wood, and something else, maybe warmth, memory. She closed her eyes for a second and let it all wash over her. Not a flood, just a tide, steady, gentle. In that moment, Ruth felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not youth, not sorrow, belonging. The summer of 1956 arrived like a song you didn't know you'd been missing. Ruth had just turned 17. Her family came to Seabreeze every July, staying in a small white cottage that always smelled faintly of lemon oil and seagrass. That summer felt different from the start. The air was warmer, the sky bluer, and Ruth, on the cusp of womanhood, felt a strange, restless kind of joy in her bones. She spent most mornings reading on the porch swing, her bare feet tucked beneath her, while gulls cried overhead, and the waves set their own gentle rhythm. But afternoons were for walking the boardwalk, for watching the small world pass by, for imagining bigger ones just beyond the horizon. That's when she saw him. Jack. He was sitting outside the boardwalk café, the one with the red and white awning, and the wooden sign that always hung a little crooked. He was alone, a notebook in front of him, steam curling from a chipped mug. He looked up just as she passed, his eyes catching hers with a smile so easy it made her forget her own name for a moment. She didn't stop. Not that day. But she walked a little slower the next afternoon, and the one after that. By the third day, he spoke. "Do you always walk with a book in your hand?" She glanced down. She had, in fact, forgotten she was carrying one. "Only when I want to look interesting," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. He laughed. "Well, it's working." That was how it began. Small moments. Shared glances. Questions asked over coffee. His voice was calm, low, like a gentle wave. She learned he was 19, working at the dock for the summer before heading back to school in the fall. He wrote poetry when no one was looking, and had once built a boat with his father. She told him she wanted to be a teacher, that she liked the smell of old books and the way sea glass looked when it was wet. They talked for hours, sometimes saying very little. The cafe became theirs. Every day, around 4, they'd meet. He'd bring 2 lemonades light on the sugar, just how she liked. Sometimes they'd sit in silence, just watching the sea. Other times, they'd talk about everything music, what cities they wanted to visit, how strange it was to grow up. She had never known someone like Jack, someone who listened, someone who asked questions without trying to fix the answers. One afternoon, he brought a tiny radio and placed it on the table. A slow song played, grainy and sweet. He didn't say anything, just stood, held out his hand, and they danced. Right there beside the cafe. Her cheeks were warm with sun and something else. People passed by, but neither of them noticed. That was the first time she realized she didn't want summer to end. Later that night, lying awake with the screen door open to let in the sound of waves, Ruth stared at the ceiling and whispered his name to the dark. Just once. Jack. It felt like a beginning. There were other moments too. He taught her how to skip stones without splashing. She taught him the names of wildflowers growing along the dunes. They laughed at the way seagulls strutted like they owned the town. She watched him draw tiny sketches in the margins of his notebook sailboats, mostly, and once, her smile. They shared ice cream cones that melted too fast and sat side by side on the carousel without saying a word, just listening to the music as it turned. At night, they'd lie on the sand, pointing to constellations they couldn't name, making up stories for each one. They once chased each other barefoot across the tide line after a sudden splash of cold water. He fell. She laughed until her stomach hurt, then helped him up. He called her reckless. She called him dramatic. They walked home, wet and grinning. Every moment had a kind of softness to it. Nothing rushed. Nothing expected. She didn't need to know where it was going. It was enough to be there. She never asked what would happen after the summer. It felt too delicate, too easy to break. Instead, she let it be what it was, simple, soft, and hers. And in the warm hush of those boardwalk days, Ruth began to understand that sometimes the beginning of love doesn't shout. It arrives in silence and stays. Edges. Ruth and Jack had found a rhythm. Mornings were their own, but by afternoon, it was as if some invisible thread pulled them back together. The cafe table was always waiting. Jack's notebook is always open. Ruth's laughter always hovered just under the surface, ready to spill out at the smallest thing. They explored more of the town as the weeks went on. The dusty antique shop tucked between the taffy stand and the bait shack became a favorite stop. Jack liked the old maps, tracing his fingers over faded coastlines like he could sail through time. Ruth liked the music boxes, each one a tiny world. One afternoon, they found a battered one that still played a lullaby, off-key but somehow beautiful. She wound it once and never forgot the sound. They spent hours walking the beach, shoes in their hands, the wet sand cool and comforting. The sky often glowed pink and orange, and the sea would mirror it back like a secret kept between them. Sometimes they talked about dreams, books, tandy places they'd never seen. Other times, they said nothing. And in that silence, there was no pressure, only peace. One night, the tide was unusually high. Waves crept close enough to touch their ankles. Jack reached down, scooped a shell from the shore, and handed it to her without a word. She held it in both hands like a gift. The shell was small, spiral-shaped, and pale pink with a crack along one edge. She kept it in her dresser drawer for years. That summer didn't rush. It lingered. Slow, soft, sweet. Like the music from the carousel or the gentle creak of porch chairs at twilight. And Ruth, for the first time in her life, understood what it meant to be completely present. Not waiting for something, not missing something, just there with the sea, the sky, and Jack. One afternoon, Jack surprised her with a picnic. He had borrowed a woven basket from the cafe owner and filled it with 2 ham sandwiches, a small jar of olives, sliced peaches, and a glass bottle of lemonade. They walked to the far end of the beach, beyond where the crowds gathered, and found a patch of dunes nestled between seagrass and wind. The sand there was soft and almost untouched. Ruth kicked off her sandals and spread out the checkered cloth he had brought. The sun hung high, warm but not hot, and a gentle breeze made the pages of Jack's notebook flutter where it lay beside them. They ate with their fingers, laughing as juice from the peaches ran down their wrists. Jack told her about the first time he saw the ocean, how he'd been 5, and terrified. She told him how she used to pretend the waves were messengers, bringing secrets from faraway lands. They spoke the way young people do when time feels endless, like summer could stretch on forever if you don't talk about its end. After lunch, they laid back on the blanket and stared at the sky. The clouds moved like they had nowhere to be. Ruth traced shapes with her finger an elephant, a sailboat, a crooked heart. The wind tugged gently at her hair, and the sound of waves filled the silence like a lullaby. Jack turned his head to look at her. "You're the kind of girl people write stories about," he said softly. Ruth smiled, unsure how to respond. Compliments had always embarrassed her, but this one felt different. It didn't come from admiration. It came from seeing. So she just said, "Then promise me it's a happy one." He reached for her hand and nodded. "Always." And in that moment, beneath the endless sky, Ruth felt something, shift something she couldn't name yet. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was something quieter, truer, like sunlight soaking into skin. And it stayed with her, long after the sun slipped low and their shadows stretched into evening. August crept in softly. The days grew a little shorter, the breeze a little cooler. Tourists began to thin out, and the boardwalk quieted. But for Ruth and Jack, the world had already narrowed to just the 2 of them. They had become a kind of rhythm. Every Tuesday, they shared a cone from the old ice cream stand. Jack always picked mint chip. Ruth changed her flavor each week, claiming she didn't want to get too predictable. He teased her, but always asked for a bite. On Fridays, they walked to the edge of town, where the cliffs overlooked the sea. He'd carry a blanket, she'd bring a book, and they'd read aloud to each other, his voice steady, hers sometimes catching on the wind. When they paused, the waves filled in the silence like punctuation, soft and dependable. Their hands found each other more easily now, not with drama or declarations, but with the simplicity of comfort. They moved like people who had always known each other. Like the space between them had never really been there. She began to notice the little things more, the way his brow furrowed when he wrote, how he always paused before turning a page, the way he looked at her like she was already part of his story. One night, they snuck onto the carousel after hours. The gate hadn't been locked, and Jack convinced her it was fate. They picked horses side by side and rode in slow circles under the moonlight, the music silent, their laughter echoing into the stillness. The moonlight painted the horses silver, and the whole world felt paused, like even time was holding its breath for them. Afterward, they sat on the steps of the café, her head on his shoulder, their feet bare and sandy. "Do you think," Jack said quietly, "that some people are meant to find each other?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She just looked up at the stars scattered, and Imperfectin squeezed his hand a little tighter. And in the stillness, they both understood that the answer didn't need words. The end of August arrived with a whisper. Not a warning. The sun still shone. The waves still rolled, but there was a hush to it now. Like the world had sensed the change before Ruth and Jack would speak it aloud. His departure had always lived at the edges of their summer unspoken, but present. He was due back at college in September. She knew that. He had told her the first day, but knowing something isn't the same as feeling it come closer. One afternoon, they sat by the pier, legs dangling over the edge, toes just above the water. Jack was quiet. Ruth watched a crab scurry over the rocks and said softly, "When do you leave?" He exhaled slowly. "Next week." She nodded, not trusting her voice. The silence between them felt heavier now, not restful, but full. "I'll write," he said. She turned toward him. "Promise?" "Cross my heart," he whispered, tracing an X over his chest. They didn't make plans, didn't talk about next summer. That would have made it too real. Instead, they spent those final days gathering every last minute. More walks, more late-night carousel rides, more stories shared under starlight. They memorized the way each other laughed, the sound of their footsteps in sync on the boardwalk, the quiet way Jack would tuck her hair behind her ear when the wind blew strongly. Ruth never asked for more than he could give, and Jack never gave her less than his whole attention. On their last evening, they danced one more time beside the cafe. The radio played low from inside, a crackling old tune. His hand was warm in hers. The world slowed down, just for a little while. They didn't speak much that night, but when they looked at each other, it was all their everything said and unsaid, everything they had shared in those golden weeks. And when he kissed her, it wasn't a goodbye. It was a thank you. For the time, for the laughter, for the memories they had made together, and for the love that would quietly echo long after the summer slipped away. The morning Jack left, the sky was cloudless. Ruth stood by the same cafe where they had met, watching the bus idle at the end of the boardwalk. Jack had hugged the cafe owner, tipped his hat to the baker, and then turned to her. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, like he was memorizing the freckles on her nose, the way she held her elbow when nervous, the soft way she smiled through tears. He handed her a folded envelope. "Don't open it until I'm gone," he said. Then he kissed her once as soft, and Shurand boarded the bus. She waited until the vehicle was just a dot on the road before she opened it. The note inside was short, a few lines in his familiar handwriting. "Thank you for the summer. You made it feel like I've always known you. Like, I'll always know you." Ruth read it once, folded it back, and slipped it into her dress pocket. She walked home slowly, the wind at her back, the sun warm but no longer golden. Seabreeze felt quieter now. The boardwalk creaked a little louder. The ocean no longer hummed with joy, it just moved. Everything was the same, yet it no longer felt like hers. In the days that followed, she stayed close to the routines they had made. She ordered lemonade at the cafe. She walked the cliffs. She even sat once more on the carousel steps, watching the painted horses blink in the daylight. It felt like she was walking through echoes. She tried writing a letter, started it 3 times, tore up each one. Nothing sounded right. Nothing could capture what that summer had been. Eventually, she settled on a postcard, just a sketch of the coastline and 2 lines. "It's quiet without you. Hope your days are good ones." She never got a reply. September turned into October. The leaves in her hometown began to change, trading green for gold. Ruth started her final year of school, surrounded by familiar faces that now felt distant. She walked through hallways and sat in classrooms, but part of her had remained in Seabreeze, drifting like mist along the boardwalk, waiting for a letter that never came. She told no one about Jack, not because she was hiding him, but because it felt like their story lived in its own time, too delicate to explain. What could she say? That they danced beside a café to a song no one else could hear? That she had never felt more known by someone who barely spoke more than a few hundred words? So she carried him quietly. She began collecting small things in an old postcard of a carousel, a worn shell from a craft store, a handkerchief that reminded her of the one he always carried in his pocket. She kept them in a small wooden box beneath her bed. It wasn't a shrine, just a way to keep something soft within reach. She would run her fingers over them on quiet nights, not to remembers he didn't need reminders, but to feel near to something that had once made her heart feel full and light at the same time. Winter came. Snow blanketed the streets. Life went on as it does. There were dances, holidays, essays due, and mornings when she forgot to think of him. But every now and then, when the wind whistled just right, or the radio played a slow, crackling tune, Ruth would close her eyes and feel herself back in that summer again, barefoot, smiling, hand in hand with a boy who said she belonged in a story. And in those moments, she believed she still did. She didn't grieve what they'd had. It had been too gentle for grief, too complete. There was no pain, just the echo of something beautiful that had passed through her life, like sunlight through curtains. And she knew, some people don't stay, but they stay with you. Years passed. Seabreeze became a memory tucked between pages of a life well lived. Ruth graduated, went on to college, became a teacher. She married once, kindly but briefly, and when it ended, she returned to her own quiet rhythm books, students, summer gardens. She never had children, but her life was full in quieter ways. A life shaped not by headlines, but by soft mornings and handwritten notes. She never stopped wondering where Jack had gone. Not every day, not even every year, but sometimes on long walks home, or when the sky took on that particular blue that only appeared before a storm, she would think of him, of the way he looked at her like she mattered, like she always would. She searched once. Years later, just once. She found nothing, but that felt okay. It wasn't regret she carried. It was something else, something quieter, something more whole. She had loved, and had been loved, for a moment that stretched wider than time. And in that memory, she was never alone. Now, as an older woman, she found herself back at the edge of that beach. Seabreeze hadn't changed much. The cafe still stood. The ocean still moved in its soft, endless rhythm. And Ruth, walking the shoreline once more, didn't ache for what was lost. She smiled for what had been. And when she stood where the waves kissed the sand and the wind wrapped gently around her, she closed her eyes and whispered his nominal in longing, but in thanks. Jack. Ruth walked the beach with slow, careful steps. The same sand, the same sea, and yet everything had changed. She was 72 now. Her bones didn't move the way they once did. Her hands, soft and lined, still reach for the waves like they used to, but with a different kind of intention. Less reaching, more receiving. The sun was dipping low, casting golden light across the tide like it was painting everything in memory. She passed the old café still there, still leaning slightly to the left. A new family ran it now, but the awning was the same faded red and white. She smiled as she passed it, not slowing down. Some places don't need revisiting, just remembering. Further along, she came to the cliffs. The wind here was stronger, more insistent. It tugged at her shawl, her silver hair, her breath. She stopped and looked out across the water, letting her eyes follow the line where the sky met the sea. It wasn't sadness she felt. It was something deeper, something rooted, a knowing that once, in this very spot, she had read aloud to someone who listened. That once, her voice had carried stories into the wind, and someone had caught them like petals. She sat carefully on the bench that had been added since her last visit. A small plaque read, "For those who remember." It felt like it had been waiting just for her. She closed her eyes and let the ocean speak. There was no rush, no ache. Just the quiet hush of waves and the steady thump of her hair told her. Slower, but still moved by the same tide. And in that stillness, she felt him. Not in a way she could touch, not even in a way she could fully explain. But there, in the breeze, in the rhythm of the sea, in the shape of the clouds, she knew. Some presence doesn't leave. It just changes form. She smiled, leaning back slightly, letting the wind cradle her. She didn't need more time. She just needed this moment, and she had it. She stayed on the bench long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The colors faded from gold to violet, then into the soft indigo of early night. A few stars blinked into being above her, the kind of stars you only saw in small towns, away from city lights. They felt familiar, like old friends lifting their heads to say hello. Ruth thought of all the versions of herself who had walked this beach. The girl who giggled barefoot in the surf. The young woman who stood on this very cliff, with tears in her eyes and a letter in her hand. The teacher who once brought students here for poetry readings. The woman who had returned, again and again, in memory if not in body. Each version felt like a thread in the same soft tapestry, and Jack was woven through them all. She took a small notebook from her bag and opened it. The pages were nearly full scenes, reflections, tiny stories she'd written over the years, always in summer. She turned to a blank page and began to write not a story this time, but a letter. "Dear Jack," she wrote, and for the next few minutes, her hand moved gently across the paper. She didn't write about sorrow, or distance, or time lost. She wrote about how he made her feel, how one summer had lasted a lifetime, how his kindness had shown her how to love gently and without expectation. When she finished, she folded the paper in half, held it to her heart, and then tucked it into the pages of the notebook. It wasn't a goodbye, just a closing of a circle. She stood slowly, turned toward the shore, and began her walk back through the town. The boardwalk creaked beneath her feet. The cafe lights glowed from inside. A soft song played on the radio behind the counter. She paused, smiled, and kept walking. Back to the quiet, back to herself. And under the soft cover of night, she felt at peace. The stars hung still above Seabreeze. The tide, now full, whispered against the shore with a rhythm so even it could have been a heartbeat. The town had gone quiet. Porch lights flickered. Windows glowed dim. And Ruth, back in her small room at the inn, sat by the open window, wrapped in a soft shawl, listening. Everything felt slower now, not because time had paused, but because she had caught up to it. The ocean moved in long sighs. The wind curled around the corners of buildings. A distant bell chimed from the boardwalk clock tower own low note. Then silence. Ruth closed her eyes. The scent of salt and distant bonfire lingered in the air. Somewhere nearby, someone was laughing gently. Music barely audible floated from a radio. Something old, something she once knew the words to, but didn't need to sing now. She leaned her head against the wall and let the stillness take her. Memories came not in flashes, but in waves. Slow, gentle, familiar. Jack's smile, the shell, the sound of his steps beside hers. But there was no ache, only warmth, only peace. Her breathing slowed, her body softened. She felt safe here, in this place that had once cradled her youth, and now held her older self just as kindly. She whispered a final thought to the night. Thank you. Not to anyone in particular, just to everything. The wind answered by brushing lightly against her cheek. She climbed into bed, pulling the quilt over her shoulders. The room darkened, the world stilled, and with the sound of the sea in her ears, and a heart full of quiet love, Ruth let go, not of life, but of the day, and drifted into sleep. And somewhere just beyond the edge of dreaming was a café with a red and white awning, a boy with kind eyes, a song that played softly, just for her. The boardwalk was empty. The air was warm, and she was 17 again, barefoot in the sand, laughing at something only Jack could say. No pain, no time, only the rhythm of the waves, only peace. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts loosen like boats untethered at the dock. You are safe now. You are held. And just like Ruth, you are home, where memory becomes calm and the night carries you gently forward. Sleep well. Some stories don't end. They simply settle, like sand after the tide, into the quiet corners of our hearts, where they stay with us. Not loudly, but lovingly. Like a favorite song you don't need to hear to remember. Ruth's story was never about loss. It was about something found and kept. A feeling, a season, a love that lived on. Not in presence, but in peace. If this story brought you comfort tonight, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a kind comment. Your words help us bring these gentle stories to more people who need them too. Until next time, sleep deeply. You are safe. You are loved. And you are home. Good night.